I remember the sound before I felt the pain, the blunt, ugly thud of Harold Carter's fist carving the stale air of our living room. The smack was so loud it seemed to bend the room for a second. Picture frames chattering on the wall as if they were teeth in a winter wind. My body lurched backward and clipped the arm of the sofa, the impact sending a shiver through my ribs. He was drunk again. Even before he spoke, the smell told me, cheap bourbon that crawled over my skin. Sour and relentless. When he bellowed, the whiskey rode his breath like a siren. You deserve this pain, he snarled, each word flung like a bottle against a wall. His eyes were glassy and overbright, his face a raw red mask. And the next punch turned the room into a smear. A lightning sting split my cheek. My palm came away wet when I touched it. Blood slid in a thin line from the corner of my mouth to my chin. I tasted iron and bile. The lamplight haloed everything in a jaundiced haze and the carpet burned my knees like coarse sandpaper. My heartbeat crowded my ears, loud enough to eclipse the TV's low drone and the refrigerator's hum in the kitchen. It wasn't a rhythm anymore, it was a desperate drumline that sped and stumbled. Tripped then sprinted. I knew these beats, panic ripping through my chest. Breath jerking shallow and wrong. The world narrowing like a tunnel squeezing shut. Somewhere near the archway, my mother froze. Donna's hands clutched the hem of her sweater. Knuckles white, her lips parting around a plea that never came out. Stay out of this or you're next. Harold barked without looking at her. She stopped breathing for a beat, then stared down at the scuffed hardwood as if it could swallow her whole. A crisp click cut through the air. My stepsister, Madison, 17, camera always ready like a weapon she didn't have to hide, leaned back against the wall. Smirk lifting one corner of her mouth while she angled her phone high. Smile, Lily, she said, mocking sweet. This one's going online. I wanted to shove her, to grab the phone, to hurl it at the ground and grind it into dust. But my muscles felt locked. Every nerve rigid with the cold logic of survival. Move and it gets worse. Cry and it gets worse. Breathe wrong and it gets worse. My chest cinched tighter. Each inhale snagged halfway up. Thin and whistling. Pain jabbed my ribs hard enough to make me see little sparks around the lampshade. Harold's shadow swallowed the light as he loomed over me, his shape warping with my dizziness. You learn respect or you don't get up, he growled. He liked performances, he liked a stage, he liked an audience. We were a captive theater, my mother a statue. Madison a gleeful critic, me a body for bruises. I pressed my fingertips into the rug just to feel something I could control, the rough loop of fiber. The tiny grains of grit pressed into it from shoes no one cleaned. Another blow clipped my temple and everything tilted. Sound sloshing in and out. Voices warping like I was underwater. My heart lurched into a sprint. Then hesitated. Then hammered again. The gap between beats felt like a cliff's edge. The room narrowed to Harold's shoes. The black leather scuffed at the toes. And the smear of my own blood where my mouth had touched the rug. I clawed for air and could not find it. Each inhale felt like a straw jammed into a sealed jar. I remember thinking, ridiculously, stubbornly, that if I could count to 10, the world would right itself. I made it to 6 before the numbers slid apart. I was 20, old enough to vote, old enough to drive, old enough to stay up all night writing dreams I never showed anyone. But none of that mattered in that house. Harold was ruler by proclamation, judge by his own rules, executioner with a heavy hand, provider. He called himself when he wanted obedience, man of the house, when he wanted worship. To him, I was an inconvenience with a heartbeat. To Madison, I was an endless joke. To my mother, I was a knot of love and guilt she could never untie. He reached for me again and I flinched on instinct, vision pulsing at the edges as if someone was dimming the lights with a faulty switch. The pain spread outward in a bright bloom, then retreated to a sick throb. I tried to stand, to fold myself upright, to show some scrap of spine. But my knees slid and I dropped to my side. I could hear Madison's quiet laugh. The phone's tiny lens blinked like an eye. The humiliation was its own heat. Worse in a way than the bruises because shame knows how to burrow under skin and sit there, waiting. My mother moved one step, then stopped, shoulders hunching, apology already on her face. Please, she whispered, so soft that even I barely heard it. For a second I wanted to scream at her. Say my name louder than his. But Harold's head snapped toward her and the warning in his gaze locked her in place. The air felt thick, like summer heat in a car with the windows up. Only it was February and the heater rattled weakly. I hated how the house could be crowded and still feel empty. How we could all breathe the same air and not share a single thing that mattered. The floor tilted. My pulse stuttered again, fast. Then a hollow stop. Then a slam. Fear is a liar, a voice said in my head. But fear was also right. It said don't provoke. It said don't breathe too deep. It said do not look him in the eye. I tucked my chin, tasted the copper in my mouth. The living room clock ticked steady, insolent in its calm, an ordinary sound in a night that was not ordinary at all. Outside, a siren wailed somewhere down our street, then faded. Inside, the only siren was my heartbeat. A runaway horse dragging the rest of me behind it. Harold crouched enough that I could see the broken thread along the seam of his shirt sleeve. The pale arm hair standing up with the electric charge of fury. You will learn, he said, slower now, like he'd found a lesson plan he liked. People think abusers are all shouting and fists. But the quiet can be worse. In the quiet he smiled. And it wasn't relief, it was the mean grin of someone who knows the rules and writes them as he goes. He didn't have to say the next line out loud. I owned your scholarship. I own your choices. I own your breath. He owned nothing but his rage and our fear. But for a long time that felt like everything. The room snapped smaller. I could hear the ceiling fan making a soft click each time the loose pull chain grazed its metal base. Funny, the details your brain pins to when it can't handle the big picture, the fan clicking. The rug's fray by the coffee table. The way Harold's wedding ring had a faint nick. The blue vein flicking at his temple. I thought about running but the idea was ridiculous. A movie scene with no exit built into our cheap little set. The front door might as well have been an ocean away. My throat worked around a sob I refused to make. I wanted to be steel. I was still learning that steel bends before it breaks. I felt the swoop first. The sick elevator dropped beneath my sternum. The edges of the room turned gray. Sound slid further away, as if someone was turning the dial down a hallway. The last thing I saw in sharp focus was my mother's face, wide eyes. Wet lashes. A love that didn't know how to stand up for itself. I hated her for a breath and loved her for two. And the math of that was its own bruise. Madison's phone drifted into the frame like a moon. I wondered, in some detached fragment of thought, how many views my collapse would get. How many laughing comments would stick to it like gum. How many times my pain would replay on tiny screens in hands that didn't care. Then the world cut out. No fade, no mercy, just black. For anyone standing in that living room. It must have looked like my heart gave up. Like I'd been taught respect the way a dog is taught with a shock collar and finally learned to go limp. Inside the blackout there was a brief, terrifying quiet, a moment where even my own body seemed to step away. Where the beat that had carried me through 20 fragile years went missing. I was weightless, then nothing, and in that nothing a single thought shone stubborn and bright, if I wake up. Something has to change. When the light bled back in, it came in fragments. The fans wobble. The beige ceiling stain shaped like a crooked continent. The muffled sound of someone crying and trying to swallow it. The copper aftertaste doctoring my spit. I was on my bed and had no map for how I'd traveled the 10 steps from the living room. A glass of water and a bottle of over-the-counter painkillers sat on my nightstand. My mother's offering to a god she didn't dare pray to out loud. My cheek pulsed. My shoulder barked. My ribs argued with even the softest breath. Down the hall, Harold laughed at something on TV. Easy and oiled, like the last 20 minutes were a story he'd already forgotten. I stared at the ceiling and counted again. Steady this time. Not to 10 but to a future that didn't exist yet. Each number felt like a stake I could drive into the floorboards. A way to anchor myself against the house's tilt. I wasn't brave yet. I wasn't free. I was a girl with a swollen face and a secret that had finally named itself out loud. If I stayed still, this house would bury me. I pressed my palm to my bruised ribs and felt the drum there. Stubborn and still mine. That was the moment my story truly began. even if no one else could hear the start of it but me. The faintest memory I have of safety was a smell, sawdust and soap. Clinging to my father's shirt when he hoisted me into his arms. His laugh was warm, a sound that filled the air like summer, and for a time it was enough to make the house feel like a sanctuary. But he died suddenly when I was 10, and the memory grew faint, receding like a tide that never returned. My mother, Donna, was left with bills stacked like bricks and fear she could not disguise. Within a year, she remarried Harold Carter. At first, Harold seemed like salvation, flowers in his hand, promises in his mouth, a solid paycheck from his job at the factory. He called himself a provider, a man who could steady the ship of our broken family. For a while, I wanted to believe him. I wanted to think that life could stitch itself back together. But Harold was not stitching, he was stripping the fabric apart. Behind closed doors, the mask slipped early. He wanted control, not love. It started small, comments about what clothes I wore, whether I was polite enough at the dinner table, whether my chores were completed, on time. Soon, it expanded into a system that wrapped around everything. What food we bought, how money was spent, even what friends I was allowed to see. Each rule was framed as care. "I'm protecting you," he'd say, but the tone was iron. By the time I was 12, Harold had taken over every dollar that entered the house. My mother's wages from her part-time job went straight into his account. Even the scholarship checks I won later from writing contests were confiscated. Folded into what he called responsible management. I didn't understand it then, but I do now. This was financial abuse. The quiet cousin of fists and shouting. I once found an article online years later that defined it perfectly. Financial abuse occurs when one partner uses money as a means to control and limit the other's independence. It felt like the definition had been carved from my own life. My mother shrank quickly under his system. She had always been gentle, soft-spoken, a woman who hummed while she cooked and read books in bed. Harold chipped away at that softness. He corrected her constantly, mocked her choices, and gaslighted her until she repeated his words as if they were law. "He provides, we obey," she whispered one night when I begged her to stand up for me. She believed it, or maybe she was too tired to believe anything else. And when she repeated his phrases, it was like watching her own voice evaporate, leaving only his echo. Then there was Madison. She was 7 when Harold moved in with us, bright-eyed, already spoiled, eager to play the role of princess. Harold adored her, showering her with gifts and indulgence, excusing her tantrums. In his eyes, Madison could do no wrong. In mine, she became my rival, though I never asked for the competition. She learned quickly that she had Harold's shield and my mother's silence. To her, I was just the girl who didn't belong. The shadow in the corner. She weaponized it early. "You're not family," she'd whisper when Harold wasn't looking. When he was looking, she'd put on her sweetest smile and call me, sis, knowing he'd beam with pride. Her dual faces taught me that cruelty didn't need fists to leave bruises. By the time I entered high school, the dynamic was cemented. Harold ruled, Madison thrived. My mother floated like a ghost between us, unwilling to disrupt the balance. And me? I became the outsider in my own home. I learned to keep my voice low, my footsteps quieter, my needs smaller. I remember once standing at the kitchen counter with a bowl of cereal. Harold walked in, frowned, and said, "We don't eat junk for breakfast." Then, without missing a beat, he poured Madison a bowl of sugary cereal 5 minutes later. I stared at the difference and felt the sting, not just of hypocrisy, but of erasure. Rules weren't rules, they were weapons tailored to keep me in place. In school, I read about gaslighting, the way abusers twist reality until you doubt your own mind. It clicked instantly. Harold was a master at it. If I said he'd promised me something, he'd sneer and claim I was imagining things. If I remembered his words exactly, he'd accuse me of being dramatic. When I cried, he told me I was manipulative. When I kept silent, he called me cold. There was no way to win because winning wasn't the point. The point was to erase me, little by little, until even I questioned whether I existed as anything more than the girl who irritated him. Once, when neighbors came over for dinner, Harold filled his glass again in front of everyone, laughed. Feeding her is like throwing money into a fire. Just an extra mouth to feed. The table went quiet, the guests shifting awkwardly. My face burned as I stared at my plate, wishing it would swallow me whole. My mother glanced at me, guilt flooding her eyes, then looked down without a word. Madison giggled, repeating the phrase under her breath. The next day at school, she told her friends. Soon, the name, extra mouth, echoed in hallways I couldn't escape. The cruelty didn't stop at the front door, it traveled with me. A shadow I couldn't shake. I tried, sometimes, to fight back. Once, I begged my mother to let me apply for a summer literature program in another state. Harold exploded. He accused her of tearing the family apart, of wanting to abandon him. She cried until she backed down. And I learned then that my dreams were dangerous to even speak out loud. When I asked if I could get a part-time job, he said it would distract from chores. When I won a small scholarship, he folded the check into his wallet and called it family money. Over and over, he reminded me, nothing is yours. Everything comes from me. And over, my mother's silence reinforced it. The house itself seemed to learn his lessons. Family photos appeared on the walls. But I was absent. Harold never included me in portraits. Sometimes, he'd take pictures and deliberately angle me out of the frame. Once, I overheard him telling someone I wasn't on the family health insurance, waste of money. He said, my existence was tolerated only as a foil. A punching bag. A reminder of what he could control. Madison adored it, seizing every chance to mock me. If I cooked, she made gagging noises. If I wrote an essay, she tore it up. Her words stung because Harold nodded as though they were truth. And when my mother whispered, just ignore them, honey, it was like she was asking me to ignore fire while I burned. But somewhere in the quiet corners of those years, a tiny ember glowed. Books became my secret window. Writing became my rebellion. I filled notebooks with stories of girls who broke free, who built lives where no one could touch them. Harold once caught me scribbling and sneered, no one pays for poems. Before tossing my notebook into the trash, I fished it out later, my hands shaking, and copied the stories again. It wasn't much, but it was mine. My words were my proof that I existed, even if the house tried to erase me. That was my childhood after my father's death. A house rebuilt not on love, but on domination. A stepfather who ruled, a stepsister who mocked, a mother who vanished into silence. I had no money, no freedom, no place where I belonged. But deep inside, beneath the bruises and the shame, there was still that ember, stubborn, quiet, waiting for air. I didn't know then what it would take to make it flare. I only knew that if it ever went out, I'd be gone too. High school was supposed to be a season of growth, of possibility, of learning how to stretch toward a future. For me, it was a season of boundaries and bars. Invisible but unbreakable. Harold would not allow me a part-time job. It will distract you from what matters, your responsibilities here, he said, his tone making clear that responsibilities meant scrubbing, folding, obeying. He called money a man's business. If I brought it up, he would slam his hand on the table until the dishes rattled. Even when I earned recognition in small writing contests, the checks were snatched from my hands with the same smug decree: family funds. The message was unmistakable. I owned nothing. Not even my achievements. I learned quickly that even outside the house, Harold's grip reached long. Once, I begged to attend a summer writing program in another state, a chance to learn, to breathe away from the suffocating air of our home. My mother's eyes had flickered with hope when I showed her the application. But Harold crushed it beneath his rage. He accused her of betrayal, of trying to tear our family apart. She cried that night, her tears quiet but endless. And I knew then she would not defy him again. The program became a ghost in the trash can. And so did the part of me that had dared to imagine escape. Meanwhile, Madison flourished. Harold adored her in a way that left no doubt who mattered. She strutted through the hallways at school with new shoes, new gadgets, new confidence, and she weaponized all of it against me. Rumors dripped from her lips like poison. She's pathetic. Her own family doesn't even want her. By the time I reached sophomore year, I was a target of laughter. Extra mouth became my nickname, echoing down locker-lined corridors. Each time I heard it, I felt myself shrinking smaller, though I never let tears fall where anyone could see. At home, Madison sharpened her cruelty like a knife. She tore my essays in half, claimed my clothes as hers, accused me of stealing. And Harold? He nodded approvingly, as if her cruelty was proof she had inherited his strength. But even cages sometimes have cracks where light filters through. For me, that light came in the form of Ethan Miller. He sat 2 rows behind me in literature class. A boy with a quiet presence and a steady gaze. He noticed when I flinched at loud noises, when I lingered over the pages of novels longer than anyone else. Once, after class, he asked, "Do you write, Lily? You always look like the words mean more to you than to anyone else." I froze, embarrassed, but nodded, when I handed him a short story scribbled in the margins of my notebook. His face lit up. "Your words have weight," he told me. "Don't let anyone make you think otherwise." It was a small sentence, a handful of syllables, but to me it was oxygen. For the first time, someone saw me, not as an inconvenience, not as a burden, but as a voice worth hearing. That year, another figure entered my story, Mrs. Parker. My literature teacher. She was sharp-eyed, the kind of woman who never missed a detail. She noticed the way I wrote furiously during assignments, the way my stories carried pain between their lines. One afternoon, she pulled me aside. "Have you ever considered entering the National Young Writers Competition?" she asked. I stammered that I had no money for entry fees, no support for something so ambitious. She smiled gently and said, "I'll cover the fee. You just write." For a moment, my chest swelled with something dangerous, hope. I went home that night and scribbled pages in secret. Stories of girls who fled, who carved their own freedom from stone. Of course, Harold dismissed it all. He caught me writing once and sneered, "No one pays for poems." He tore a notebook from my hands and threw it into the trash. Madison laughed, delighted at the spectacle, and mocked, "Fairy tales for a fairy girl." But later, when the house was quiet, I retrieved the notebook, smoothing its wrinkled pages. I kept writing anyway. The act of putting words down was rebellion in itself. It was proof that I existed, even if Harold wanted me erased. Ethan's kindness deepened that rebellion. He began lending me books, sliding them across the desk with a smile that made my cheeks warm. We whispered about stories during class breaks. And for those minutes, the weight on my shoulders lifted. At lunch, when Madison and her friends mocked me from across the cafeteria, Ethan would ask about my latest story as though he didn't hear them. Sometimes I believed he truly didn't, because to him, their cruelty was noise, and my words were signal. His presence stitched fragments of my broken confidence back together. Still, the contrast was brutal. At school, I tasted glimpses of freedom. At home, I suffocated. Harold's rules grew harsher as I aged. He monitored my phone, rifled through my bag, checked my room for secrets. My mother's whispers of apology became background noise, useless against his control. Once, after a barbecue where I forgot napkins, he shook me by the arm in front of neighbors, calling me incompetent. The guests looked away, their silence as sharp as his grip. Later, Harold laughed it off as discipline, but the bruises on my arm said otherwise. I carried them to school under long sleeves. Ashamed, terrified someone might ask. Mrs. Parker noticed anyway. She once placed a hand gently on my desk and said, "Whatever you're carrying, you don't have to carry it alone." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to hand her the truth wrapped in my trembling palms. But Harold's voice haunted me. "If anyone finds out what happens in this house, it'll be the last thing you do." His threats were chains, and I obeyed them. Still, I entered the writing competition. I wrote at night with the lamp dimmed low, scribbling stories in a notebook hidden beneath my mattress. My entry was about a girl trapped in a tower of glass, where every wall reflected her fears back at her. In the end, she shattered the tower with her voice. I didn't expect to win. I only wanted to prove to myself that I could write the ending Harold tried to deny me. The day I submitted the story, I walked into class with shaking hands. Ethan asked why I looked nervous. And I told him I'd done something reckless. He grinned and said, "Sometimes reckless is just another word for brave." I carried those words home with me, clutching them like a secret talisman. They burned against the cold silence of the house, reminding me that not everything Harold said was law. Somewhere beyond those walls, there were voices who believed I was more than a burden. Somewhere, a version of me existed who could be more than invisible. But Harold's shadow never allowed light for long. That night, he stormed into my room, furious that he'd discovered the application fee receipt Mrs. Parker had covered. His words were venom. "Trying to sneak around me? You'll never make it without me. Never." His rage was a storm I could not stop. But inside me something refused to die. Even as his voice cut me down. Even as Madison laughed from the hallway. Even as my mother whispered apologies from the kitchen. I thought of Ethan's steady gaze, Mrs. Parker's faith, and my own words scratched into paper. They were my ember, glowing stubbornly in the dark. I wasn't strong yet. I wasn't free. But I was writing. And for a girl who was told daily she was nothing, the act of telling her own story was the first defiance that mattered. The pattern of abuse was like a rhythm etched into the walls of our house, predictable yet terrifying. Harold drank. Harold shouted. Harold struck. And the silence afterward was thick enough to choke on. Madison reveled in it, her phone always ready, her cruel smile a mirror of his. Each slap or kick was punctuated by the click of her camera lens. It wasn't just violence anymore, it was spectacle. And I was the unwilling star. I tried to tell myself I didn't care, that her videos wouldn't matter. But humiliation burned deeper than bruises. Somewhere out there, people might laugh at my pain, scrolling through it as entertainment. The thought made my chest ache in a way even Harold's fists couldn't match. One evening, Harold found an envelope addressed to me, the letter confirming a modest academic scholarship for the next semester. I had tucked it into my notebook, praying he wouldn't notice. But Harold always noticed. He ripped it open and read aloud in mockery, his voice booming through the house. Awarded to Lily Carter. He sneered at the words as though they were poison. "You think money belongs to you? You think you can have secrets from me?" The paper crumpled in his fist, falling to the floor like a crushed wing. When I dared whisper, "It's mine. I earned it," his fury ignited like gasoline. The slap sent me sprawling, the taste of blood exploding in my mouth. Madison giggled in the corner, narrating to her phone like she was hosting a reality show. And here she goes again, crying over nothing. My mother hovered near the sink, her hands wringing, her eyes wide, but her voice silenced by Harold's glare. Her silence was its own betrayal, one that cut deeper each day. The humiliation stretched beyond our four walls. At a neighborhood barbecue, I forgot to bring napkins outside. Harold seized the opportunity. In front of guests, he grabbed my arm and shook me hard enough to blur my vision. "Useless," he snarled, his voice sharp as glass. The laughter and chatter around the table faltered. But no one intervened. The neighbors looked away, focusing on their food, pretending not to see. I felt myself vanish in real time. Not just at home but in the eyes of the community. Later that night, Harold called it discipline. I called it erasure. Madison took the insult further. Extra mouth. Harold had once called me in front of others. And she turned it into a brand. At school, kids repeated it in hallways, shouting it as if it were my real name. Even teachers looked away, unwilling to confront the cruelty. I wanted to scream, to vanish, to fight back. But the weight of shame sealed my lips. The house had taught me that silence was survival. At school, it became habit too. But silence is never absolute. Sometimes, it cracks. And the first crack came from our neighbor, Evelyn. She was in her 60s. Her gray hair always pinned neatly. Her garden a burst of color across the fence. For years, she had probably suspected something. But I had hidden my bruises under sleeves and makeup. Trained myself to smile politely when I saw her. Then one sweltering afternoon, when Harold's anger boiled over in the yard, the truth spilled into the open. He accused me of stealing money from his wallet. His face blotched with drink. His grip on my arm was iron, bruises blooming instantly under his fingers. He shook me so hard my teeth rattled. Madison appeared in the doorway, Smirking. Filming again. My mother's voice floated weakly from the kitchen, please. Harold, but she never came outside. When Harold slapped me across the face, the sound cracked through the air like a whip. That's when I saw Evelyn, peering over the fence. Her eyes widened, her hand tightening on the post. For the first time, someone else was there, someone who saw. Harold, that's enough, she called out, her voice steady and firm. He froze for half a second, caught in the act, then muttered about discipline, but Evelyn's gaze didn't waver. Her presence was a wedge in his performance. He dragged me back toward the house, muttering threats. But something had shifted. Someone outside the walls finally knew. Later that evening, Evelyn knocked on our door carrying a plate of cookies. Her excuse to step inside. Harold glared but let her in. She scanned my swollen cheek, her sharp eyes missing nothing. When Harold left the room to fetch another drink, she leaned close and whispered, "You are not alone, dear." The words were so simple, but they nearly undid me. My throat tightened, tears threatened to spill. I couldn't answer, fear still locking my tongue. But she seemed to understand. As she left, she pressed a folded slip of paper into my hand. Inside was her phone number and 4 words, "Call me anytime. Day or night." I tucked it into my journal, my hands trembling. For the first time in years, I had an ally, a fragile thread of hope stretched between me and the world outside. It wasn't rescue, not yet, but it was proof that the walls Harold built weren't impenetrable. Someone had seen, someone had spoken, and that changed everything. Still, the silence inside our home thickened. My mother moved like a shadow, her eyes heavy with guilt but her mouth sealed shut. Madison strutted, her laughter sharper than ever. Harold remained the tyrant, his voice the law. But Evelyn's words echoed in my mind. You are not alone. They didn't erase the bruises, but they gave them context. They didn't erase the shame, but they reminded me shame was not mine to carry. For years, I had believed I was invisible. Now, I knew at least one pair of eyes truly saw me. And once seen, I could never be erased so easily again. Nights in that house stretched long and suffocating. I lay awake listening to Harold's heavy steps pacing the hallway, the clink of his glass against the counter, the sudden flare of his voice when the bourbon loosened his rage. Madison's muffled laughter drifted from her room, the glow of her phone screen flickering beneath her door. My mother's silence weighed like an anchor on the floorboards. In that darkness, I realized survival meant more than enduring, it meant documenting. If Harold loved to bark his authority, then his own voice could betray him. That thought became my secret weapon. I dug through the clutter beneath my bed and pulled out an old cell phone. One without service but with a functioning recorder. The first time I tested it, whispering my name into the microphone, I felt my heart pound like I was committing a crime. But when I played it back, my voice came through, thin, shaking, but undeniably mine. That night, when Harold stomped into the kitchen demanding dinner, I slipped the phone into my pocket and pressed record. His tirade filled the device, every insult etched into memory. Later, I scribbled the date and details into a notebook I hid behind the lining of my backpack. Each entry was a scar I refused to let fade. My bruises would heal, but the words would remain. Recording him was dangerous. Every time his voice rose, I had to mask the tremble in my hands as I reached for the hidden phone. Every time Madison mocked me, I jotted it down in shorthand, then tucked the page away. I created stashes. Memory cards slipped into hollowed-out books, notes hidden beneath floorboards, scraps of paper sewn into the lining of my jacket. Each act of defiance was small, but together they were proof that I was more than Harold's victim. I was a witness against him. Even if no one else believed me, I had evidence. At school, Ethan noticed changes I tried to disguise. I wore long sleeves, heavy makeup, forced smiles, but he saw through it. You've been quiet, he said one afternoon, his eyes steady, quieter than usual. I shrugged, muttering that I was tired. He didn't push, but later he texted, "If you ever need somewhere to go, even for a night, my door's open." The kindness in those words threatened to unravel me. I wanted to tell him everything, to hand over the truth I carried like a stone in my chest. But Harold's voice echoed louder. If anyone finds out what happens in this house, it'll be the last thing you do. Fear caged me, even when hope offered a key. Still, I found other outlets. Late one night, huddled beneath my blanket with the glow of my mother's old laptop, I stumbled across an online forum for survivors of domestic abuse. At first, I only read stories of women hiding bruises under scarves, of children silenced by threats, of men who used money like shackles. Their words pierced me with recognition. They were strangers, but their pain mirrored mine. Slowly, I began to write anonymous posts. My stepfather controls everything. He says nothing is mine. My stepsister records my pain for fun. My mother is silent. I feel erased. The replies came like whispers in the dark. You are not alone. Keep records. Plan carefully. There is life beyond survival. I clung to those words the way I once clung to Ethan's smile and Mrs. Parker's encouragement. Each response reminded me that the cage wasn't eternal. But Harold sensed the shift in me. He prowled more often, rifled through my backpack, demanded to see my phone. One afternoon, he barged into my room without knocking, yanking open drawers, sneering when he found nothing. You think you're clever, he muttered, his breath sour with alcohol. But I see everything. My pulse thundered as he pulled clothes from hangers, flipped my mattress, searched as if I were a criminal. He didn't find the recorder hidden beneath the loose floorboard, but his suspicion grew heavier with each passing day. After he left, I pressed my back to the door, shaking with relief but also with pride. He hadn't beaten me at my own game. Not yet. His control tightened. He began confiscating coins from my bag, demanding receipts for every dollar. Liar. He barked when I couldn't produce them. Meals became another weapon. Madison scraped her leftovers onto my plate with a smirk. That's all you're worth, she taunted. If I refused, Harold slammed his hand on the table, ordering me to eat every bite. My mother whispered, please, Harold, but her voice cracked like brittle glass. And she fell silent again. In those moments, I felt utterly alone. Yet each time, I pressed record, my pocket buzzing with the quiet defiance of capturing his cruelty. The nights were worst. Harold's voice echoed through thin walls, his footsteps relentless. Sometimes Madison laughed, her mockery slipping into my dreams. I cried quietly into my pillow, the recorder clutched in my hand, documenting the storm. It would have been easy to collapse under the weight of it, to let the darkness swallow me. But I repeated a mantra I had read on the survivors forum. If I don't fight back, they will destroy me. Those words burned like a tattoo against my ribs. Ethan's presence at school became a lifeline. He noticed the stiffness in my movements, the way I flinched at sudden sounds. Once, he pulled me aside after class. Lily, he said, his voice low, you don't have to go through whatever this is alone. I forced a smile, muttered that I was fine. But his gaze lingered, unconvinced. The next day, he pressed a folded note into my hand. If you ever need help, just say one word. I tucked it into my journal alongside Evelyn's phone number. 2 lifelines, fragile but real. The contradiction defined my days. Outwardly, I played the obedient stepdaughter, nodding, apologizing, completing chores without complaint. Inwardly, I built a case. Recordings, journals, hidden drives. I knew the risk. If Harold discovered the evidence, he would destroy it, and maybe me too. But silence was a worse fate. My mother's silence, Madison's mockery, Harold's tyranny, they were all pieces of a cage designed to erase me. My secret archive was proof that I existed, that their cruelty was not invisible. And then came the moment that proved Harold's paranoia wasn't misplaced. One afternoon, as cicadas screamed in the trees and the air hung heavy with summer, Harold accused me of stealing from his wallet again. He followed me into the yard, his hand clamping around my arm, bruises blooming instantly. Madison appeared, filming as always, her smirk painted across her face. My mother's voice floated weakly from the kitchen, begging him to stop, but her body never moved. And then I saw Evelyn, standing at her fence, her eyes sharp and unflinching. That's enough, Harold, she called, her voice cutting through the haze. For the first time, his violence was not a secret. Someone outside had seen. Inside my chest, The ember flared. The cage had cracks. And the cracks were widening. The night the storm finally broke began with something deceptively ordinary. The house smelled of fried onions and bourbon. The ceiling fan clicking in its uneven rhythm. Madison sprawled on the couch scrolling through her phone. I had just returned from school clutching a letter, a new scholarship acceptance. It was small, but to me it was a lifeline. Proof that my words and work mattered somewhere beyond Harold's walls. I tucked it between the pages of a book, praying he wouldn't notice. But Harold noticed everything. He stormed into the living room waving the envelope like a weapon. You dare to make plans without my permission? His voice rattled the glass in the cabinet. My mother, already pale with tension, rushed forward, hands wringing. Please, Harold, let it go. He shoved her aside so hard she stumbled into a chair. Her cry swallowed by the air. Madison, grinning, raised her phone as if this were her favorite television show. Harold's eyes blazed when they landed on me. You think you can leave? You think you can make a life without me? You are nothing. His fist came down across my face before I could answer. Pain exploding in a hot bloom. I hit the carpet, ribs screaming, the metallic tang of blood rushing over my tongue. His boot struck my side once. Twice. Respect, he bellowed, is what you owe me. My mother sobbed, begging him to stop, but he turned on her with a growl. Stay quiet. Or you're next. She folded into silence, trembling, her face buried in her hands. Somewhere through the blur of pain, my mind clawed toward a plan. Under the couch, hidden beneath the lining, was a USB drive filled with recordings of Harold's tirades. If I didn't survive the night, someone had to find it. With trembling fingers, I pushed it deeper under the couch, praying he wouldn't notice. Madison's laughter, low and delighted, filled the room. Her camera caught every strike, every sob, every gasp. What she didn't realize was that her evidence would become her undoing. Then came a knock, loud, insistent. Evelyn's voice cut through the chaos. Harold? I heard shouting. Panic flickered across Harold's face, quickly masked by a scowl. Keep her quiet, he barked at Madison. She darted to the door, telling Evelyn we were fine, that we were just arguing over bills. Evelyn's voice was sharp with suspicion. But after a tense moment, her footsteps retreated. Harold turned back to me. Fury redoubled. He dragged me up by the arm, his breath hot against my cheek. If anyone ever finds out what happens in this house, it'll be the last thing you do. He slammed me into the wall, my head striking plaster, stars bursting across my vision. I crawled toward my bedroom, my body refusing to stay upright. Behind the locked door, I collapsed beneath the bed, clutching my second recorder. With shaking hands, I pressed the button. My voice, slurred but audible, whispered the date, the blows, the threats. Then I shoved the device deep into my backpack. Outside, Harold pounded the door, his voice venomous. My mother's cries mingled with his roars. A chorus of fear. The pounding grew louder, and darkness tugged at the edges of my vision. But this time I held on to one thought. Even if my body failed, my evidence would not. The next morning felt surreal, as if the violence had been a dream carved into my flesh. My ribs ached, my lips swollen, my head pounding. Harold sat at the kitchen table sipping coffee, his calm demeanor more chilling than his rage. Madison scrolled through her phone, smirking at something on the screen. My mother moved like a shadow, silent, her hands trembling as she scrubbed dishes. I clutched my backpack to my chest, knowing it carried the weight of my survival. By afternoon, the knock came again, louder, more insistent. Evelyn stood at the door with 2 police officers flanking her. Harold rose quickly, forcing a smile. Officers, what seems to be the problem? His voice was slick, but a vein throbbed at his temple. Evelyn's eyes cut straight to me, lingering on the bruise blossoming across my cheek. The way I held my side. I heard enough last night, she said firmly. The officers stepped inside. Harold barked that it was a family matter, that Evelyn was interfering, but she produced a flash drive from her pocket. My heart stuttered. She must have found the copy I had slipped beneath her fence earlier that week. A desperate backup plan. The officers plugged it into a laptop. Harold's drunken voice roared from the speakers. You are nothing without me. followed by the sharp crack of a slap. Madison gasped, her phone slipping from her hand. My mother covered her face, sobbing. Harold lunged for Evelyn, spitting that it was fake. But the officers blocked him. Sir, calm down, one warned, hand brushing his holster. With trembling fingers, I pulled my recorder from my backpack and pressed play. My own weak voice filled the room, describing the beatings, the dates, the threats. Madison shrieked. She provoked him, but the unlocked screen of her phone told another story, my battered face. Harold's fists. My mother's cries. The officers exchanged a glance, then moved swiftly, hands behind your back. The click of the cuffs was louder than any of Harold's shouts. He cursed me, Evelyn, the officers, but his words no longer carried power. Outside, neighbors gathered, drawn by flashing patrol lights. For years, Harold had been the man of the house, the voice that cowed everyone. Now he was just another criminal shoved into the back of a police car. Madison wailed, but when the officers replayed her own video, her sobs collapsed into silence. My mother finally broke, her voice raw as she whispered, "It's true. Everything she said is true." Evelyn wrapped an arm around her trembling shoulders. I clutched my backpack tighter, my body aching but my spirit burning with a new realization. Justice had stepped through Harold's door. And for once, I was not invisible. The hours after Harold's arrest felt dreamlike, as though I had stepped into a parallel universe where the rules of fear no longer applied. At the hospital, fluorescent lights glared above me. Antiseptics stung the air, and the rhythmic beeps of machines monitored the body he had tried so many times to break. Doctors poked and prodded, ribs bruised, cheek swollen, shoulder sprained, shallow cuts cleaned and bandaged. For once, the pain meant something. It was evidence, not just another secret to hide beneath long sleeves and excuses. When the curtain rustled open and Ethan walked in, my breath caught. His face was stricken, his eyes filled with a grief that wasn't his to carry but that he bore anyway. He hurried to my side, his hand wrapping gently around mine. "You're safe now," he whispered, his thumb brushing across my knuckles. Tears rose before I could stop them, spilling silently onto the pillow. Safe. The word felt alien, like the language I had never been taught but suddenly understood. For the first time in years, I let myself believe it might be true. Detectives came later, notebooks open, voices calm but firm. I told them everything, the shouting, the fists, the threats. My voice shook, but I forced the words out, each sentence like opening a locked door. I handed them the USBs, the recorder, the journal with its careful dates and details. They nodded gravely, telling me the case was strong. Harold faced multiple charges: domestic violence, assault, attempted murder. Madison, who had filmed gleefully instead of helping, was placed in juvenile custody. When I heard the judge had ordered her into a rehabilitation program, I felt a strange mix of anger and pity. She had been molded by Harold, poisoned into cruelty, but she was still a child who had never been shown another way. My mother began therapy almost immediately, guided by a social worker who visited the hospital. One afternoon, she sat at my bedside, her hands trembling as they folded over mine. "I failed you," she wept, her voice raw. "I chose fear over courage. I let him erase me. And in doing so, I let him erase you." For a moment, I wanted to turn away, to let the years of betrayal stand between us forever. But her tears, real and unrestrained, cracked something open. I whispered back, "Then start again. Be my mother now." It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was a beginning. After my release, Evelyn insisted I stay with her. Her small home smelled of lavender and lemon polish, her garden blooming just outside the kitchen window. She cooked hearty meals, fussed over my bandages, left the porch light on at night so I wouldn't feel alone in the dark. Sometimes nightmares woke me, Harold's shouts echoing in my head. And Evelyn would sit beside me until my breathing slowed. "You're not invisible anymore," she'd remind me. In her house, silence was no longer suffocating, it was peace. Ethan visited often, carrying books, sometimes flowers. He didn't always talk, sometimes he just sat with me, his presence steady and quiet. One evening, He read aloud from a collection of poems. His voice a bomb. As he spoke, I felt something unclench in my chest. For the first time since childhood, I believed in gentleness. When he looked up and caught my gaze, I thought of his words in the courtroom later. Words that would root deep inside me. Your heart didn't give out that night, Lily. It just started beating for yourself. Weeks slipped into months. The bruises faded, though the scars inside me pulsed like phantom pains. I began to write again. Not just in secret notebooks but openly. Hungrily. I started a small anonymous blog where I poured my story into the void. To my surprise, people found it. Other survivors who left comments filled with their own grief and resilience. Your words gave me strength. One wrote. Another. I thought I was alone until I read this. My voice, once silenced, had become a lifeline for others. Each post lit a fire I didn't know I carried, turning my pain into proof of survival. The trial was both torment and triumph. Standing in court, my hands trembled, but my voice did not falter. The jury listened as Harold's voice thundered through recordings. His fists caught on Madison's videos replayed on the large screen. He glared at me from the defense table, eyes filled with the same fury that had haunted me for years. But his power was gone. Each replay stripped him bare. Each testimony from Evelyn and my mother built the wall higher against him. When the verdict came, guilty on all counts, the judge's gavel struck like thunder. Harold was sentenced to decades in prison. The sound was final, a door slamming shut on years of terror. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, but all I heard was Ethan's voice, low in my ear. You won. Lily, you're free. For the first time, the word didn't feel fragile. It felt earned. My mother wept openly beside me. Not from fear but from release. Evelyn stood tall, her hand firm on my shoulder. And in that moment, the world felt wide again. When I returned to the old house, it was different. The locks were changed, alarms installed, Harold's shadow gone. Madison's absence left silence in the halls. But it was a silence I could fill with laughter and words. My mother and I rebuilt slowly. Fragile but determined. She cooked without fear. I wrote at the kitchen table without glancing over my shoulder. Sometimes, I caught myself smiling at nothing at all. A strange new reflex I was still learning. I am 20 now, scarred but alive. My story began with fists and blood. With a heart that stumbled and nearly failed. But it did not end there. It ended with justice, with healing, with a voice no longer silenced. And it continues still, with every word I write. Every survivor who reads them. Every beat of a heart that finally, defiantly, belongs to me.